This is E&P Audio, a service of Editor and Publisher Magazine. Since 1884, the authoritative voice of news publishing.
Welcome back for an unimpeachably chilly new episode of E&P Reports, the official podcast from the staff of Editor and Publisher Magazine. I'm your host, Bob Andelman. First, allow me to interrupt myself with a housekeeping note. I can't explain it, and fortunately, I can't be blamed for it, but the E&P channel on YouTube went down in virtual flames this past weekend. As a result, you might have to look a little harder to find us. But please don't give up. Search Editor and Publisher on YouTube and please subscribe or resubscribe today. Thanks, and now back to our regularly scheduled interviews. This week, we bring you two new conversations with industry leaders and challenge you to once more look at news publishing with fresh eyes, or eye. Later in the show, in our feature interview, Dennis Draughon talks to E&P contributing writer Rob Tourneau about what it means to be a political cartoonist for a TV station. You can be sure that's of interest to Tourneau, himself a cartoonist for the Philadelphia Inquirer. But first, the Salt Lake Tribune drew a lot of interest in recent weeks when it was announced that the legacy Utah Daily had uprooted its financial structure and become a nonprofit news publisher. Tribune editor Jennifer Napier-Pearce talks to E&P contributor Sean Wood about what it all means for Salt Lake City, and possibly for your paper as well. Sean?
Thank you, Bob. Welcome to E&P Reports, Jennifer.
Hi, thank you so much for the invitation.
Nonprofit news gathering is nothing new, but what does it mean for the Salt Lake Tribune and for the news industry in general that you are the first legacy newspaper to become a nonprofit news organization?
Gosh, what does it mean? It means that we have hope for long-term sustainability. I think a lot of local newspapers have just been struggling to the point where, thousands have closed. And that's just not acceptable for our owner, Paul Huntsman. He really wanted to find a sustainability model that would go well beyond his ownership and really, serve this community in the way that it has since 1871. And so, what it means is that local news, local investigative, deep watchdog reporting will be strong in Salt Lake City and throughout the state of Utah for a long time to come.
How long had this been in the works? It seemed like at least 6 months or so. Well, when was the announcement made by Mr. Huntsman that this was the path that he wanted to pursue?
We started studying it in earnest middle of last year. He made the announcement earlier this spring. I may be confusing the months. I know that we applied in April and May for our two foundations. And so I think we made the public announcement slightly before that. But yeah, he bought the paper in 2016, really thought that this was going to, turn around. He could find a financial model that worked for local newspapers. Searching did not result in anything that was substantive on the for-profit side. As our advertising declined and our circulation continues to suffer, he just did not think that there was going to be a recipe that worked for us. And so at that point, we really started to look seriously at a nonprofit component. I was hired on it in 2016, and I brought up the nonprofit component, not for the entire newspaper, but perhaps a small foundation or something like that to augment. But, that was sort of a back burner idea until last year.
Now, the plans for creating a nonprofit news gathering organization, that's still part of this, is it not?
Yeah. So really, we talked to a lot of different news organizations. We sort of found pieces that we liked and thought could work on the local level here. Poynter Institute, Lemphis Institute. We thought that those were elements that would really work here, but it wouldn't be the entire solution. So we are creating a foundation similar to those arrangements. It's called the Utah Journalism Foundation, which is dedicated solely to supporting not only the Salt Lake Tribune, but scholarships, the next generation of journalists here, and local independent news projects throughout the state. So that's one piece of it. But then sort of the groundbreaking piece is the transition of the legacy newspaper itself into the nonprofit. So I think either one of those in isolation was not going to give us the roadmap for long-term sustainability. Both of them in tandem, we think, are going to work.
What was the reaction of the staff when they learned that this was the decision this was the path that was being pursued? Did it make them nervous? Newsrooms are generally pretty nervous, especially lately.
Yes, indeed. I wouldn't say actually that was the initial reaction. The initial reaction was, wow, we've got a plan. And here it is, because as you know, newsrooms have been disrupted so many times. And the Tribune, of course, is not an exception to that. We've had layoffs here. It does something to a newsroom when you see continual cuts and no light at the end of the tunnel. I think the initial reaction was, this is so great. We like the contours of this plan. As people started to really think about what this means to the news gathering and what it means to our place in the community, that's sort of where some of the questions have cropped up, is on governance. I mean, for so long, for the last 3 years, we've had a sole owner. Now we're going to have a board of directors. What does that mean? Who's going to sit on the board? How's that going to affect my job? And how do I navigate sort of reporting around big donors? And so that's sort of where the questions are right now. I mean, at this point, I can point to bylaws. It's all still very theoretical. So I think until we actually get going, full steam ahead, it'll settle out some of the questions and concerns. But I mean, overwhelmingly, I've had tremendous support from the newsroom. We met as a staff again yesterday just to talk about the mission-driven thing that we're becoming, how we engage a little bit differently with our community as a nonprofit, but the journalism ethics, the deep dives that we are known for, that's going to continue. And I think that has settled some nerves around here.
When do you expect, I guess, to have that structure in place and move forward from that point? How long is that going to take?
It's hard to say. I mean, our attorneys, we filed in May. We thought that there would be some back and forth with the IRS because this hasn't been done before. And so we expected a little bit of pushback. Hey, what about this? What about that? That never came. We just got our approval.
Right, right.
This is months ahead of when we had anticipated doing the big switch. We, according to our lawyers, we were following their guidance, and we thought it would be in the end of first quarter next year. So again, we have been working diligently toward that goal, but we're not there yet. So there's a lot of entanglements on the ownership thing. I would suspect that maybe in the next 3 to 4 months, we'll be ready to be a full-on nonprofit. Right now, the status is a shell of a company, and none of the legacy assets have been transferred to that new nonprofit. So, again, we don't have insurance. We don't have accountants, all that kind of infrastructure that needs to be in place, membership people, fundraising mechanisms, that is underway. And I'm hoping within 3 to 4 months, we'll make the official change.
What has been the reaction from the community?
So far, so good. We absolutely had to scramble to get a donate button, like we didn't have that on our website yet. We didn't have any language explaining what this transition meant for people. And so we did that over the course of a weekend. And we announced it publicly on Monday morning, and everybody was just so happy for us. We had an immediate outpouring, lots of emails. But then, after that elation, then come the questions. Well, who's going to be on your board? And how does this work? What does it mean for my individual subscription? So again, I think people just generally are very, very happy to see that there is a path towards sustainability long term. But there are still a lot of questions that remain, and I imagine that's not going to end for quite some time, if ever.
So what does this change in terms of how coverage or what you can write about at the Tribune, being a nonprofit organization?
Not too much. I mean, that was one thing in our application that we left wide open. We went from the basic argument that what we do as a local community newspaper feeds the community just like any charitable asset. So a public asset serves the public good. And we argued that sports feeds a community, that food reviews feed a community, that, of course, the investigative watchdog element is there, but the entire mission that we have had, for years and years and decades, and has built up trust in the community, that is charitable in nature. And the IRS bought it. So, really content-wise, we are not prevented from anything except for the political endorsements. And over the ownership changes, that policy has changed. Some publishers have decided they want out of the endorsement business. Some have gone whole hog on it. But that is the one thing that federal law will prevent us from doing is candidate endorsements. We can still weigh in as an editorial board on the issues of the day, but we really can't tell people who to vote for. That's the only limitation.
Have you been contacted by any other publications about the process? And if so, can you name names?
I don't want to out anybody because, I think people are exploring a path. This is one path we think is going to succeed. But, our circumstances are unique. We have a sole owner who is willing to donate the asset to the community. Not everybody has that circumstance. We are limited by geography in some ways. And so, it may work for some newspapers. I don't want to say that this is the grand solution for saving journalism, but it may be for some, which I think is great. And just based on the initial response from newspapers outside of the state, newspapers inside of the state, I will say that, there's some optimism around looking to see how this formula could work. Our application, we've had a couple of attorneys approach us who represent clients and said, hey, we tried this a few years ago. And we were rejected. So we want to look at your application and see, sort of compare and contrast. What did you say that we didn't say, or vice versa? And all of that information, of course, is public. We're happy to share it with anybody who thinks they might be able to get some benefit from it. But yeah, the short answer is yes. Lots of interest from newspapers, from lawyers representing newspapers. I'm quite encouraged to see that, people do see some potential here, which is great.
How much longer could the Salt Lake Tribune have survived without becoming a nonprofit? Because I think people who may have some understanding of the industry and some understanding of your market don't realize you're still a 2-newspaper town, right?
We are in a long-term relationship since the 1950s in a joint operating agreement with the Deseret News, and that is set to expire at the end of next year. Our ownership change will not affect that relationship. The Tribune has changed hands over the decades before, and we've had this business side relationship with the Deseret News that is being negotiated right now. I will say that nonprofit status does not insulate us from the pressures in the industry. I think that there is a consumer-driven response to newspapers that you cannot ignore. Younger generations aren't drawn to the print product as much as us old-timers. And so I just think, we're going to have to follow those market forces wherever they lead us. So how long could we have been printing? It's sort of an open-ended question. Our ownership didn't prevent us from doing anything other than allowing people to support us in a bigger way. When I became the editor in 2016, I had a lot of people say, I have been a subscriber for 30 years. I love the Tribune. I want to see you succeed. What else can I do? And my answer was, buy advertising, like there was no other option really for people to support us. Now this really does open doors to say, I can give a little bit more than my basic subscription every single month. I can give a little bit more at the end of the year as part of my charitable giving. So I think that piece of it. Oh, and we can also, approach foundations and other wealthy donors who can help us out with the cause. That is an avenue that was not available to us just a couple of weeks ago. So I feel it's not going to save print in perpetuity. I mean, I think we have to all be realistic about that. On the other hand, I do think it will extend the life of print.
With, I guess, what are some of the things that need to happen? As you said it will extend the life of print. What not everybody can be the New York Times, not everybody can be the Washington Post. They've seen incredible spikes in their subscription rates. So what are the other things that the Salt Lake Tribune needs to do to maintain, to be sustainable?
Yeah. So our digital ad revenue, the sad reality, a lot of it is funneled to Google and Facebook. And so we cannot rely on that. That will be an income stream, but we'll pay taxes on it. Mm-hmm. We continue to ask for subscriptions. So it's a very transactional relationship, but there is this emotional layer that we really haven't tapped into yet. And I do think that, if people believe in local journalism, that they can't imagine not having that, constant news stream of what's happening on their street, in their neighborhood, on Capitol Hill, locally. I think that, as people start to think about what journalism means to them, they will be open to giving a little bit more.
This may be an oversimplification or whatever you'd like to call it, but 18 months ago you had to do the very difficult thing of paring down your staff, and this is after winning a Pulitzer Prize. Do you see becoming a nonprofit maybe preventing that from happening in the future, or staving that off, or how does this help keep that from happening?
That is the absolute goal, is to not just survive, but thrive even in a higher level. I do take a lot of confidence in a lot of the digital only nonprofit news organizations that are making it, and they are building out newsrooms that are really strong, robust, community supported. Some of them have scale, like you mentioned, the New York Times. We don't have that here on the local level, but I do take a lot of heart that we're not the only nonprofit news organization out there, and we have seen success on that in the public radio, the public TV, digital only sphere. So I do think that that gives me a lot of hope that we can call on our community to say, look, if you like what you're reading, if you want more of that, you need to support it. We have partnered with Report for America. We've been lucky enough to have 2 Report for America reporters in our newsroom right now. And so we've sort of dipped our toe into that this year, just the nonprofit fundraising aspect. It's amazing what happens when you ask. And I think that's fantastic. I do really believe that as we go forward, this will open up some new resources for us, and we won't have to go back to the dark old days. I mean, I don't know. I'm counting on this to work, but I don't know the future. But I will say that there is a track record of success with nonprofit news organizations that gives me a lot of hope.
Jennifer, I really do appreciate you taking the time to join us on E&P Reports. Is there anything else that you'd care to add or something that we might not have covered that you'd like to discuss?
Well, check back with me in 6 months when we've actually made the transition, how things are going. Right now, I'm just buoyed by the fact that so many people have reached out and said, we want to support you. I'm also encouraged by the other news organizations that are looking for a solution. I hope that we can help them in some way. So I would just encourage and invite anyone who is interested in learning a little bit more, seeing our documents, even brainstorming some ideas, why we chose to do things certain ways. Happy to talk to anyone and everyone about this idea, and in hopes that maybe even if it saves one other newspaper, that's success to me.
Fantastic. Well, thank you again for your time, and thank you for joining us on E&P Reports.
Thank you so much, Sean.
Thank you, Sean. Next up, E&P contributing writer and cartoonist Rob Tourneau talks to Capital Broadcasting WRAL political cartoonist Dennis Draughon. Among other topics of interest, they talk about what a print guy is doing illustrating political commentary for a broadcast company. Rob?
Hi, my name is Rob Tourneau. I am a reporter with the Philadelphia Inquirer and a writer for Editor and Publisher. Today, I'm as a cartoonist, draws cartoons for WRAL down in North Carolina, and is a winner of an EPPY Award for his cartoon work. And I appreciate you coming on the podcast. Thanks, Dennis.
Hey, thanks a lot, Rob, for having me. I appreciate it very much.
So these days, sadly, it is hard to find a cartoonist who is doing work for any media organization, much less an online media group or TV station. Tell me a little bit about your background and how you ended up at WRAL drawing cartoons.
Okay. Well, you're right. It is kind of a rare occurrence these days, but hopefully one that will, grow in importance as newspapers are transitioning into some other form. Of course, there's not a lot of work. It was never really a growth field for people who wanted to do political cartoons for newspapers, but the pickings have gotten mighty slim over the past few years. I had worked for doing political cartoons for various newspapers since my college days. I mean, I had started working at my college paper at North Carolina State University, The Technician, which is celebrating its 100th anniversary this year. I had worked there for 8 years of my undergraduate studies, and at the same time worked for the afternoon paper in Raleigh, the Raleigh Times, which is sadly defunct. But after that, I had published a book in Raleigh about the same time that my tenure at the Raleigh Times ended. And I applied for a job in Scranton, Pennsylvania, and ended up getting the job there, working as a full-time political cartoonist for the Scranton Times-Tribune for 15 years. When that job ended for me, after those 15 years, my wife and I wanted to move back to North Carolina, where I was from. And when I came back here, I started working freelance for a number of daily newspapers. One was the Durham News. Another property was called The Insider, both of which were owned by the News and Observer of Raleigh, where I covered mostly local politics and state politics. And then the last client I had was the Fayetteville Observer, which was the last family-owned daily newspaper in North Carolina up until about 2.5 years ago or so. They were bought out by a media conglomerate, Gatehouse, and I had been working for them for 12 years. And by the next 3 months after they had been purchased, they had cut their freelance budget, and I was without any newspaper clients whatsoever. So, I thought that was pretty much the end of my career. And my mentor, Dwayne Powell, who used to be the cartoonist for the News and Observer for 35, 40 years, mentioned to me that WRAL and the company that owns the local NBC affiliate, Capital Broadcasting Company, was looking for a cartoonist for their website to accompany the editorials that they write and post on their website. And so we got in touch. We had an interview. We seemed to hit it off as far as our editorial philosophies and whatnot. And so come this February, I will have been working for Capital Broadcasting for 3 years. So that's how that came to be.
How many do you draw? Or do they appear on the website and on the broadcast? Like, how does it?
No, they don't show them on the broadcast. Capital Broadcasting Company is a separate entity from the television station.
Okay.
I mean, they do have editorials on the station's website, but it is clearly the opinion of Capital Broadcasting Company, which owns the TV station. WRAL has a history of using on-air editorials. It's somewhat ironic for me as a political cartoonist. In fact, when I started long ago, back in the early 80s, one of the people that I did a lot of cartoons about, because he was the senator for North Carolina, was Senator Jesse Helms. And okay. Senator Helms used to do the on-air editorials for WRAL back in the 70s, before he was elected to the Senate. So right. It's sort of come full circle now that I'm working for the same company and the same family. And, of course, my politics are markedly different than Senator Helms's. But Senator Helms and I do have another interesting personal connection. When I was in high school, I very much wanted to be an astronaut. Being a child of the space age, growing up in the 60s, and I wanted to go to the Air Force Academy. And I was one of the appointees for Senator Helms. Unfortunately, I couldn't do enough pull-ups, so I didn't end up going to the Air Force Academy. But my debate partner from high school did go to the Air Force Academy, and he also washed out after basic. I think he got very sick, and now he's a Methodist minister, and I'm a school teacher / cartoonist. So there you go.
Right. Now, does being a teacher / cartoonist inhibit your cartoons at all? Like, does your school district principal, superintendent does that give you any hot water? You know, because I imagine you're drawing about local issues mostly.
Well, local issues, but not necessarily local issues dealing with my school district. It hasn't been an issue so far, and I pray that it won't be an issue since, my full-time job is as a school teacher. Interestingly enough, I just got a letter yesterday from the state superintendent of public schools in North Carolina, because he is one of the people that I have had occasion to do caricatures about and do editorial cartoons about. And he's actually just announced the other day that he's running for lieutenant governor, or would like to run for lieutenant governor of North Carolina. But his letter that he sent me was actually congratulating me on my EPPY Award and hoping that I would have many more years in which I would get to caricature him. So that was kind of nice.
That's great. We're bringing everybody together. That's awesome.
Yeah, I know. That was totally unexpected. But I mean, that's what's nice about the exposure from WRAL and Capital Broadcasting is that we have gotten a lot of notice from state politicians, and some of whom are, want copies of the cartoons that they've been featured in. And so, as a gesture of goodwill, we've been providing them with copies which they've had framed and put in their offices and stuff. And, that's not really my aim when I'm doing the cartoons, but it certainly doesn't hurt that they're paying attention. So
how has drawing cartoons changed over time? You've been at it for a while now. Politics seems to be much more of it now than it ever has been. You have the internet that plays into it. Does that impact sort of what cartoons you would draw or how you come up with your ideas?
I don't know that it's changed much about how I come up with my ideas. It certainly changed the way I produce my cartoons. I mean, from the 1980s up until 2004, all of my output was strictly ink on paper. Black India ink and various pens and pen nibs on, Strathmore And then when I moved down to North Carolina, that's when I started to become a little more digital. These days, it's still sort of half and half. I mean, I draw the lines on paper and then scan it in and work to finishing it in Photoshop. And prior to working for Capital Broadcasting, I had not worked in color before. So that was a brand new experience for me. But, I mean, as far as how politics is... Well, I'm sorry, Robbie, I think you asked me also how politics, the changing nature of politics, if that's changed anything. I mean...
Right.
Certainly as a younger man with more fire in the belly, I think for some of the publications I worked for in the past, I could get away with a lot more and maybe even tried to get away with a lot more.
Right.
And while I'm still trying to get across my personal opinion since I signed my work, when you're working for a media company that doesn't want to alienate its viewers, but still wants to have a conversation with them. I am kind of mindful that, there's certain limits probably to what I could or should say. So, I think that's just the nature of the market.
Self-imposed. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. And again, it's also a matter of age and maturity too. I mean, there's certain things that I would have done as a younger man where I wouldn't have cared about the consequences, and I don't really have the luxury of doing that these days, since I have a family to think of and things of that nature. So,
right. Do you draw many national cartoons? I ask because I'm interested in the idea of
of what
Trump. Much of what Trump does as president is something that is easily lampoonable, but it's almost predictable in a weird way. So I'm always interested in what cartoonists and satirists, how they come up with original concepts to parody the president.
I would have. I guess I would be completely tired of drawing Trump if that's what I did. If I did just steady national cartoons like I did when I was a full-time staff cartoonist in Scranton, I think I would have quickly tired of covering his antics. And I've been fortunate that for almost all of the newspapers and media companies that I've worked for have wanted me to try to stress at least half or more of my work on local politics. And frankly, local and state politics is what you really have more effect on, because local and state politicians will pay more attention to what you're doing. I mean, I doubt that the president would even know that I'm alive, much less care what I thought about him one way or the other. Not that that's, the thing that you're shooting for when you're doing a political cartoon, but I think it's, in particular with the current president, I think it's kind of hard to keep up with some of the things that he has done, both policy-wise and personal behavior-wise, that are certainly merit attention and strong comment and strong commentary, but there's so many other things going on as well that also need our attention.
Right.
So.
Right. You've been someone, you spoke about the consolidation of the industry, you witnessed a bit with your paper being purchased by Gatehouse. Talk a bit about that, the impact of the economics of the newspaper business and how it has impacted political cartooning specifically.
Oh, wow. Well, it's radically changed the nature of the market. I mean, when I first had a glimmer that I wanted to be a political cartoonist, the person who I most wanted to be was my mentor, Dwayne Powell, who had worked for the News and Observer covering, state politics in North Carolina and as an institution in the state until he passed away. And he's a great loss to the institutional memory of our state and the political memory of our state. But he was the person who I modeled myself. I mean, that's who I aspired to be. Someone like Dwayne, who had a similar sort of career, working for a similar sized metro daily. Be even better if I could have worked for, a capital city newspaper. I know when I was working in Scranton, at one point I had hoped to get a job in Albany, New York, when a friend of mine there, Rex Babin, moved on to the other coast working in Sacramento, but it was not to be. I don't know that since one of the things I don't miss about living in northeastern Pennsylvania was the weather, that I don't know that if my family had ended up in Albany, if we would have been any happier. But
Right,
I'm much happier being back home here in North Carolina. My parents were here. I went to high school and college here. A lot of my college and high school friends are here, so I feel much more at home. As a son of the South, I'm more in my element here. I mean, I was kind of a fish out of water when I lived and worked in Scranton because I'm a WASP, raised Protestant Methodists. And when I lived in Scranton, the vast majority of the people that I knew and interacted with were Irish or Italian Catholics. And while that wasn't an unbridgeable cultural gap, it was one that did cause some tension at times, depending on the subjects that I was asked to comment on.
So there was a cartoonist feature on, in Scranton. Was there any connection to you or your work?
Say that again. I'm sorry.
There was a cartoonist featured on The Office, the TV show The Office, and.
Oh yeah. Well, let's say it. So I have no evidence, no hard evidence that it is definitely a reference to me, but I like to claim that it is because the television show was in production, pre-production and production when I was still the cartoonist at the Scranton Times. And there is an episode in one of their seasons where Pam, the receptionist, has a date with the Scranton Times cartoonist. And in their date, he actually, the cartoonist that's depicted actually mentions and describes a cartoon as very similar to one that I did about the same time. It was about, I hate to admit this, but it was about freedom fries. So from that, and the producers of the show had spent a lot of time in Scranton and even in the Scranton Times newsroom doing research because they referenced an awful lot of actual places in Scranton. So, whether or not that was their actual intention, no one has countered my claim. So that's my story, and I'm sticking with it. So.
So how do you brainstorm cartoon ideas? Like, what's your process now since your day job is being a teacher? How has that changed your process, and what is your process? Well,
it's a whole lot different than when I was a full-time cartoonist, obviously. I mean, then I had the luxury of taking the entire day to ideate and to sketch and to jot little notes to myself and read various newspapers and news sources and stuff. And now, of course, the time pressure of my full-time job, I maybe get to ideate during my lunch, and I have about 15, 20 minutes of lunch during a school day. Occasionally, when I have a free planning period where I don't actually have to meet with my PLC, which is the teachers that I plan lessons with and stuff, or have faculty meetings or whatnot. So if I have a free time during a planning period, I might actually get 15 or 20 minutes to do that as well. Sometimes I'm not able to do it during the day at all and have to wait until I get home, and which by that time, of course, I'm pretty tired. But I have deadlines to meet, and deadlines are something that have been hardwired into me for the past 38 years. That's not something I'm going to miss. Maybe that's to my failing that deadlines mean that much to me. But that's something that I try to inculcate in the students that I teach. I mean, many of the students that I teach don't have the same sense of a deadline that a professional journalist would have. Like if I say there's a deadline for this school project to be turned in, well, I think most of my students take that more as a suggestion, whereas you and I know that a deadline is a hard, fast thing. If you don't do it, there's some real estate in the paper or something that goes blank, and then you might not get paid after that. So anyway, so it's changed. It's definitely difficult, but I'm just really thankful that and grateful that Capital Broadcasting has offered me this opportunity, because otherwise I would basically my career would basically be over. I mean, I wouldn't really have any reason to, stay up late at night and meet deadlines if someone weren't paying me for that. So, and that's
Right.
I'm very grateful for that.
So you talked about the impact your cartoons have at WRAL, which is a digital outlet. They're not appearing like in a newspaper anywhere.
Right.
The irony, of course, at this time is most cartoonists' work are a lot more popular than they were 20, 30 years ago because of the internet, but the economics are so tough. What are companies like RAL getting that, say Gatehouse or Gannett or some of these other companies that have ditched their cartoonists? Like, what are they missing about not having a cartoonist on staff or even using freelance cartoonists?
That's a great question, and that's a question that I wish that the folks in the boardrooms of companies like Gatehouse would reassess their priorities, because I don't think we're talking about a big capital outlay here, but I think you really do get an awful lot of bang for your buck, because a local cartoonist can skewer local politicians and local political policies in a way that an editorial might be able to, but maybe not with the same immediacy,
right,
or the same effectiveness. I mean, sometimes even a gentle poke from a cartoon can be much more effective than a written editorial. And sometimes a not so gentle poke from a cartoon can be more effective than a written editorial. I question the short-sightedness of many traditional media companies that have sort of dropped the ball and done away not just with cartoonists, but I think of like music reviewers and movie reviewers and local columnists. I mean, when I look at the paper I at one time really wanted to work for and did work for sort of in a sideline, the News and Observer, I'm still a subscriber and will be a loyal subscriber, but there's a lot of things that used to be in the paper that I loved that are no longer there. And I think, the public that still takes the paper and still looks at the paper for coverage of what your government and what local people are doing with your tax dollars depend on something other than just that. I wish media companies were trying to make sure that we got that. My biggest public is with the death of traditional media platforms, and with maybe the slow dissolution of others, that we will end up living in some sort of dystopian society where we don't know what the people who are running the show are doing for us or to us. And I'm a big believer in what some of our founding fathers thought about as far as, a free press is essential to a democratic republic's very survival. So, I don't know. It's not a cool thing. I don't know what can be done about it, though, because the disruptive nature of the internet and many, at least at this point, I guess we have to stop and think that, it's really not been all that long. I can remember back in 1995 when the Scranton Times had their first web page, and it wasn't shortly thereafter, by the year 2000, when you could see sort of the writing on the wall that this was going to be a disruptive influence on traditional media like newspapers. But I don't know that anyone at the time really knew how to counter that. I mean, I saw lots of different things that were tried, thinking, oh, this will solve it. We'll put up a paywall, or we'll do this, or we'll do that. It hasn't stopped the inexorable decline. So, and I'm just a cartoonist. What would I know? I know what I would like to see in a newspaper. I would like to see more cartoons. I would like to see more media outlets give money to cartoonists, for their content. And because it is very popular, as you mentioned, with the web, but seems like now many people have much more exposure, but a lot less of the coin that would come with it. And that's obviously a problem for those of us who try to make our living doing this. So,
yeah. And as you mentioned, it's the ownership of corporate groups. The Scranton paper is still locally owned, and they still employ full-time cartoonists.
It is, and that's to their credit. They have had a local full-time cartoonist there for a long time. And that was one of those things where when my job ended there, my friend John Cole, who used to work for the Durham Herald Sun here in Durham, he had been let go because of a different conglomerate that bought that paper. And at the time, his politics meshed better than mine did with the Scranton Times-Tribune. And I suggested that he apply for my old job, and fortunately, he got it. And he's been there ever since. Right. I think he's been there now longer than I was, and doing a great job. And I hope they'll keep him there for as long as he wants to remain. Now, whether or not they'd have another cartoonist after John Cole, I don't know. I'd like to hope that they do, think that they do. It's something that family that's owned that paper has seemed to put a premium on, and it's to their credit, because not too many other media organizations are doing that. And I don't know that it's worth it to them on their bottom line, but that's something that they've staked out as, this is important territory. It means something to us, and kudos to them for doing that.
You're talking about impact. I was kind of curious, over the course of your career, what's the cartoon that you've drawn that's either had the most impact or had the most reaction, either positive or negative? Just curious.
That's a really hard question to answer. I know one of the cartoons that's gotten the most, that's had the most impact as far as reprints and or academic papers written about it or mentioned in academic papers. It was a cartoon I did, and unfortunately I don't have a copy to show you, but it was a cartoon where I had used the image from, and forgive me, I can't remember the photographer's name, but it's a Vietnam War image of the young girl who was running away from her village that had just been napalmed.
Right.
And I augmented that image. At the time, we were, sort of in our war with Iraq, and it was coming out about the abuses in Abu Ghraib prison and stuff. So behind the little girl in the picture, I've got the man who was in the black hood with his arms outstretched and wires attached to him. He's directly behind her, sort of in the same posture that she was in, because she has her arms outstretched as she's running. But of course, most of her flesh has been burned off of her back. Right. But so I was just sort of, I guess, comparing and contrasting, the horrible things that America does sometimes in pursuing its foreign policy objectives, and the innocents who get, trampled at the time. So that one's probably got the most attention. As far as other adverse reactions, perhaps, I remember, and I don't remember exactly what the cartoon was, but I remember when I worked in Scranton, the municipal unions of Scranton were pretty much bleeding the city dry. Most of the people who lived there were on fixed incomes, basically the World War II generation that were slowly expiring. But, and I don't fault the union members for sticking up for wanting to make a better living and getting a raise, but there was only so much blood you could get out of the rock there. And so I would take the police union to task for, the city was already in bankruptcy, and was under special administration by the state. And so we were, both the editorials for the paper and myself, we were taking the police unions to task. And at one point, someone from the police union sent a dead skunk in a box to my office at the Scranton Times. And at the same time, right around the same time, I got some threatening phone calls to my apartment in Scranton. And this person who identified himself as a Scranton police officer had said, look, we know who you are. We know what kind of car you drive. We know where you live. And if you ever get, stopped for any kind of violation, you're dead meat, basically. It was like, hey, thanks for protecting and serving. But
oh my goodness.
I can't think of anything since that time that's been as that's elicited such a strong response. I know for the 12 years that I worked for the Fayetteville Observer, the people in Fayetteville probably had the most positive response to the work that I did for local cartoons. In fact, people in Fayetteville went out of their way to create a show of my work at their local art museum As without me pushing it, they just came to me and it's like, hey, we really would like to do this. One of the mayors of Fayetteville, who also, and I guess this is probably why he was interested, had been the general manager before he became mayor of Fayetteville, of the Fayetteville Observer. When he left office, commissioned me to collect all of the cartoons I'd done of him while he was mayor so he could make a coffee table book for his family for Christmas. And that was kind of nice, because there were plenty of cartoons in there that were not particularly favorable to him, but so that was kind of nice.
So it kind of shows the difference in sort of the time, someone who can take criticism and sort of make light of it versus how vitriolic things are today, and people take offense to every little thing.
Well, and I try. This is something I've mentioned to colleagues because I work with a number of teachers who, I don't see eye to eye with politically. But to me, it's always been, and again, this is speaking from wisdom and experience. I doubt I would have given the same answer when I was in my 20s, but it seems to me that we make more progress when we look for and find common ground. I can think of some people that I work with that, at least when it comes to politics or the policies of the current president, we wouldn't see eye to eye at all. But we have a lot of other stuff in common. And I think that's more, for me, the more important thing to focus on. Because, I have to work with these people. I get along with these people in every other respect except for politics. And as long as we don't touch that particular subject, I wish our country as a whole, while still standing your ground and sticking to your beliefs, I guess we could be more respectful of each other and look for ways to try to cooperate in areas where we do agree and at least make some progress in that regard. We may not ever see eye to eye on everything, but right now I think you would probably agree that politics is just too vitriolic and it's harmful to the republic. And I mentioned to my students lots of times there's plenty of other places in the world where you probably wouldn't want to live. And as imperfect as this country is throughout its history, it's got some really good high ideals that I'd like to see us live up to one of these days. And that's what I think we should be shooting for.
I can't think of any better way to end this than the bomb-throwing political cartoonist calling for political harmony. So I think we'll end it there. Thank you very much for joining the podcast, Dennis. Congratulations on your EPPY, and hope to talk to you soon.
Thank you so much, Rob. I really appreciate the attention, and thank you so much. I'm wishing you all the best of luck as well with your endeavors, since we're both in the same boat as far as being colleagues and ink-stained wretches.
Oh, yeah.
I hope we both get to practice our craft for as long as we would like to. So thank you so much for your time, Rob. I really appreciate it.
That wraps up this week's edition of E&P Reports, the official podcast of Editor and Publisher Magazine. We hope you've enjoyed the show. Please share it with a friend, or a lot of friends, among your social media contacts, and subscribe in YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you watch or listen to your favorite podcasts. And if you'd like to rate and review the show, we sure appreciate that, too. Now, I'm your pretty boy host, Bob Andelman, saying thanks for watching, thanks for listening. And please consider checking out my other podcast, Mr. Media Interviews, now in its 13th year at mrmedia.com. That's mrmedia.com. Let's talk, edit, and publish again next week.
This is E&P Audio, a service of Editor and Publisher Magazine. Since 1884, the authoritative voice of news publishing.